So thank you for being here. And so, Drew, to get started, I thought we could just go right back and get a bit of background on you. So I believe you were born in Paisley and grew up in Scotland, and it'd be interesting to find out how you sort of came to music and how you started out in the punk scene, I believe.
Right. You know, I had always had these ideas of like wanting to make music, but I came from the culture and background that I came from wasn't hugely supportive about people, you know, tapping into their own imagination. And working class culture in Scotland at the time, it was very much you had a delineated path. You know, you went into certain types of work. Then, just before I left school, the Scottish industry collapsed completely. There was huge unemployment, and those delineated paths were not so straightforward anymore. I'd gotten into gang culture, gang life at an early age. And I was very rootless, very like, it wasn't the best path for anyone to be in. And one of my closest friends, to get me out of the gang life, took me to this place in Paisley that was putting on punk shows. Glasgow, Paisley's part of the metropolitan area of Glasgow. It's a separate town, but it's just on the outside. And it's kind of like really wild place. It still is, you know, incredible energy, but also very violent as well. But Glasgow, for some reason, had been very conservative and had banned all punk shows. So Paisley, being really lawless and not having very many rules about anything, were like, yeah, punk shows, whatever. So literally about half a mile from where I lived was like the one place in the west of Scotland that was putting on punk shows. And I went with my friend, this would have been spring of 1977, and I think the first show was probably alternative TV, ATV, so I mean, what a way for a 16-year-old to like flip their life around. I mean, it was, you know, people use that cliche, life transforming. I mean, it was a very real experience for me. It was like I knew immediately what I wanted to do with, you know, what I wanted to do, and, you know, picked up a copy of Sniff and Glue, you know, Mark Perry's fanzine. He was the main person in ATV, and he had that prescription for forming a band. They printed 3 chords and said, here are your chords, go out and form a band, which I ignored the chords, but I took the advice and started a band with my girlfriend at the time, who became my wife, Rose McDowall, who went on to huge things, and she played drums, and I had a tape machine that I made tape loops with. I had no knowledge of musique concrète or tape music. I was just kind of like feeling my way out. You know, I'd buy tapes, reel-to-reel tapes at a local flea market and just cut them up and make tape loops. I was completely clueless of any history of that work, but I was just having fun, and you know, that was what got me into making music. Had a couple of cheap, crappy synthesizers, one of which a friend had borrowed, had lent to me. It was a Korg MS-10 that had, you know, the patch bass, patch chords, semi-modular. So that was my first experience with modularity. You know, was something that became a very important part of practice.
I think that was already there quite early, that you were using this non-standard, like non-punk instrumentation.
Which, I mean, it's yeah, I mean, but at the time, you know, all of those labels of the way that punk, like the way that any movement very much fractures soon after. It fractures, but it seems more fractured historically. At the time, you know, we didn't really use terms like post-punk happened before punk, so it was one of those things. I mean, it was all punk to us, and even though that we didn't consider, we very quickly moved, a lot of people doing similar things. You know, we moved away from identifying ourselves rigorously with punk, but it was always understood that that's what informed what we were doing, you know. You know, we'd privately, because, you know, people were getting pretty cheesy when it came to some of the punk stuff, so we didn't want to identify with it, but privately we'd be like, is this punk? And we'd be like, it's fucking punk. Sorry for swearing.
So how did this sort of end up leading to Coil? Because it's there's quite a sort of big gap there.
Yeah. So I actually, I mean, I met Balance and Sleazy in probably 86, 87. It was prior to the release of Horse Rotivator. They were working on they were recording that. I'd moved to London with Rose, with my ex-wife, in 1984, and we'd made Alex Ferguson, who was a member of all of these things that happened when I was 16, they all sowed the seeds for later work. You know, I just love that. It's one of the things I love in life, you know, like, look, because I've been around forever, I'm 1,000 years old, looking back and seeing all these weird paths and how they connect, and it's like, life is weird. But, so, meeting Alex back when I was 16, and then he'd stayed in touch. I think he did some work with Strawberry Switchblade, I can't remember. When we moved to London, he introduced us to, so Alex Ferguson was part of Alternative TV, this band that I saw when I was 16, and then he became part of Psychic TV. He was actually a really key member of Psychic TV. He was from Scotland also, and an incredible musician and songwriter. He introduced all of those really poppy elements into Psychic TV. He introduced me to Genesis Peorage, and you know, immediately became kind of enmeshed in their world. And even though you know, my bio tends to have PTV, Psychic TV on it, but my actual involvement in Psychic TV was very minimal. I toured with them for like maybe 1 month doing tape manipulations, and Genesis is now part of my life, and I love her dearly, but I kind of had a falling out with her, as every single person in the world does, and they reconnect or they don't, you know. But so I had a falling out with Jen in fairly short order, probably by the end of 1986. Become friends with David Tibet, and he introduced me to John Balance. Jeff, I always think of him, you know, as Jeff, that's his real name. And we hit it off enormously. You know, there was so many points of contact that we bonded with in 1 hour in a cafe that we met. Kate Bush, Lamont Young, Philip K. Dick, you know, a whole bunch of things that we immediately bonded on, and we ended up staying friends. And but so we were friends for a long time before I did any kind of collaboration with the collaboration. The first collab came out of going to these early raves, these early techno and acid house clubs before it blew up. And again, this was when it hadn't fractured. What I was saying about everything fracturing into these like subgenres. There wasn't any real subgenres. It was just these really mad, tiny little clubs, you know, with 100 people and just sweat dripping off the walls, and everyone suitably enhanced with whatever was an enhancing experience. And we were like, we should make some music like this. And the first thing that I did with them, I'm so happy that it was never released. It was kind of like, it was a weird take on acid house and techno, but it was informed more by amphetamine than anything else, and everything was just really manic and not necessarily good, but it was like, it sowed the seeds for liking to work together. And that was actually, weirdly enough, that project was going to be called Black Light District. This was in 1988, the first time that we recorded anything. I know I saw someone trying to sell a copy on someone somehow. I haven't heard it since then. I don't even know. I'm remembering that it was not something that I wanted out there in the world.
No, well, it's interesting because the sort of the moment you appear with Coil is sort of what mid '90s, I guess, when you'll start releasing with them. And there's this really early one. What is it? Worship the Glitch.
Yes. So that
which
was
pretty quickly is sort of taking elements away from the music and being more minimal.
That was why, because Jeff and Balance and Sleazy were fully capable of doing anything they wanted to do with, you know, without having a collaborator, without having someone else. But there was the reason they asked me to join was to bring something that they didn't feel that they had, and their music up until that time had been, in a good way, kind of maximalist. They didn't have any kind of like, they didn't really feel comfortable with, you know, going in a minimalist approach. When I say maximalist, I mean it in, you know, in the best possible way. You know, like Sleazy's almost Baroque tendencies, you know, that you can hear in, you know, in Horse Rotivator and other work. They wanted to move away from that, and I was like, can we just do like an exact copy of Horse Rotivator? Still one of my favorite records of all time. I'm like, no, that's not why you're here. Yeah. So I'd done a couple of things, you know, I was on a couple of Coil records without being a member, and so with Worship the Glitch, it was this idea of, yeah, exactly. How much could you take away from a piece of music and it still not be nothing? You know, like, what is that line where it's just empty space? And, you know, we used, Sleazy was really amazing at getting interesting proprietary software that, interesting software that hadn't been fully released yet. So we would, there was software that was a kind of, it was actually a noise reduction software that was, its main role was to take unwanted elements out of the sound. We would put, and it didn't work very well, so we would feed it the program material, and it would do whatever it tried to do to strip it out. And also I would, you know, bring in some of my tape history, tape loop history as well. And then while we kind of got into this idea that there was another entity present, which I always loved that Burroughs-Geisen idea of when two or more people, well, that was specifically when two people collaborate, it creates a third mind, you know, and they called this book The Third Mind. It's always been just like such a strong part of my idea that when collaborations work at the best, a third entity is created. With this, it was kind of like that, but it was also, we called it ELPH and ELPH, and we would get these strange aberrations, you know, in no other work that we did would we get these radio breakthrough things would happen, and it really felt like another entity, and that we didn't want to really define what that entity was. Is it an alien? Is it some kind of primal, primitive creature informing it? So it was a kind of like fun thing to play with, the idea that we weren't really in charge. You know, there was also something else. Which actually,
well, you can see this quite quickly leading to Time Machines, right? Yeah. This is, so how did that sort of how did that start flourishing, the way that you were working with time machines? Because I believe you were quite important at the very first stage of this one.
Well, it was something that John Balance and I had spoken a lot about, the idea that certain types of music could really affect you deeply, could really change your perception of reality. It could be ritual music. It could be. There was one piece of music that that always did it for me. It was Pachelbel's Chacona in F minor. Had an incredibly disassociative effect on me. It made me feel like I was slipping into another time frame. So we were kind of identifying music that had this effect on us, this effect that was not easily quantifiable, and was almost always had a drone element. Lamont Young certainly. There was a certain type of Scottish bagpipe music which uses a lot of drones called pibroch, where it's a lament for a fallen comrade. Has a powerful quality. Elaine Radik's work, and I'm just kind of covering the touchstones because clearly this work didn't come out of it, nowhere. We didn't just like snatch this out of the ether. There was people had done a lot of really amazing people had done the groundwork. Actually, one person who doesn't get enough credit for the influence on time machines is Stephen Stapleton. Soliloquy for Lilith was a huge influence. Still one of my favorite pieces of music.
And that's kind of toying with there's like a ghost in the room almost.
Well,
yeah.
His process for doing that was very much, it was just a bunch of effects pedals that he laid out, cheap Boss effects pedals that he connected with chords, and he just walked around in the room, and just his presence would interact with the electromagnetic field, basically the capacitance effect, and creating one of the most important works of music in the last 50 years. So all of that kind of was part of the discussion. How do we do something that causes you to have that weird feeling of time slipping, of being not necessarily in the moment anymore, this sort of disassociative state? And I had my equipment set up. Coil had their studio in Chiswick, and I had my own kind of mini version at home with mainly semi-modular equipment, Korg MS-20 and MS-50 and a couple of other things. And I was just playing around with it, and I tapped into a drone started to emerge. It was almost like I had kind of switched my brain off and was just playing around, which often for me is the most effective way of coming to something, rather than, I have different processes. Some of them are more pre-planned, but that's always, for certain types of music, is always a really productive area. So a drone started, and I got sucked into it, several minutes later, I felt like I'd come out of like a kind of meditative trance. So I recorded this on my DAT and a few other iterations of it, and went over to the studio the next day. And Sleazy was not at home. He was making a video for someone. So Balance and I was like, John, Jeff, this might be what we were talking about, and very kind of nervously let him hear it, because I knew that I liked it, but there's always the potential for people going, really? That never goes, that never leaves. And he was like, yeah, this is exactly it. So we set everything up, and we started recording these drones immediately. And Sleazy came in, and Sleazy, Peter was a little tougher to convince. I think because he could get, like I said, more. He had a more kind of Baroque sensibility, a more maximalist approach, and he came in and he was like, "Oh, so it's all going to sound the same?" And we were like, "Yeah, yes, exactly. It's going to." And he was like, and he kind of wandered off and made himself some tea and came. We didn't know, but he was standing outside the studio for ages, and he came back in. He was like, "Yes, this is great."
Good.
Because it wouldn't, without Sleazy, it wouldn't have.
Well, so because the titles of the tracks is all named after these chemical compounds for like ayahuasca and magic mushrooms or whatever. Like, how much of a role did intoxication play? Like, not just in the process, but in the way you thought about the album.
Well, certainly, you can't. We were definitely heavily into exploration of all of that. Those titles came about after the fact, because when we conceptualized it and then recorded it, the whole idea was to access those space. A key component in it was the ability to access the space without chemicals or drugs or whatever, to be able to get to those same places. And but it didn't come from this didn't come from nowhere. I mean, we were heavily interested in heavily experimenting with psychotropic substances, some of which are not mentioned on the record. Things like ketamine and stuff like that. But after the fact, we wanted to create song titles and track titles, and I was less inclined to go with that literal approach, but it was Balance's ideas, and he was like, if you listen to each of these, they tie really strongly with this substance. I was like, I do see what you mean, yeah, and I kind of went with it because it also looked really cool as well.
That does help. Yeah.
If it does.
Well, so you performed it live the other day, and you also performed it live back in the day as well, I think.
Well, no, the only time that it was performed before, I'd already left Coil, and they used the. I didn't formally leave. I'd moved to New York, and it just didn't work, bouncing back and forward. It didn't really work out properly. So they did it at, I think, the Royal Festival Hall with Paul Sandra, but they didn't do any. It was more just using the name Time Machines, and doing other things. So it was never performed as Time Machines. The first time I performed it was for the Deus 20th anniversary show in Los Angeles, and then a couple of weeks later in New York, and this was the third time.
Well, yeah, so in reformulating these tracks with, I guess, updated gear, I suppose, like, what sort of challenges emerged during that process, but also, what's it been like performing it live for people? This is, instead of being this sort of very headphone or visceral experience in here, it's in the space. It's quite different.
I've found that it's, each of the three performances, I've found, for me, they've worked really well. I was definitely nervous about the idea of it, and I definitely didn't want to do a literal transcription, a literal copy of the work, because, it really wouldn't be interesting for me. When people, such and such a band does their classic LP live. I've never been to any of those. Actually, I did go to see Spiritualized Ladies and Gentlemen for Floating in Space, and that was pretty amazing. But generally, it doesn't interest me. I'm like, why? And wanted to stay away from that. I wanted to reinterpret it with some of the motifs and little nods and winks to some of the elements, you know, that in it. But the challenge was to create the same effect. That was fundamentally and the core. The point is to create the same effect. I'm not just going to do something completely different and call it Time Machines. You know, it's like how would I do Time Machines if I or we at Coil were doing it right now? What would the processes be, knowing what we'd done, and you know the equipment that was available to us. So that was a key thing. You know, like if it made me, this was the benchmark. This was when I was working on it. I went upstate to upstate New York to the Catskills and worked on it with the idea of being, if this makes me feel the way that Time Machines made me feel when I was originally playing with it, then it works and it stays. If it's just there for whatever, because it sounds nice, and it doesn't, it's getting thrown out. So that was the process, you know, if it was taking me into that disassociative, out of body, out of time feeling, then I felt that I was doing my job.
How would you describe the key characteristics of this music that creates that feeling? Because, I don't know, on the first track of the album, there's this certain type of oscillation that happens across the stereo field or whatever. I can't explain it, but that has a very immediate effect on you as the listener. Yeah. Like, how would you describe that?
I can't really quantify what the. It's more of it's how it makes me feel. If it feels like I'm out of the moment, you know, I know the processes that I can take to get to that. You know, there's certain cyclical elements. The important thing is that several cyclical elements operating together, you know, different cycles you hit that sweet spot of, okay, and it's almost, and this is the goal when I play live, so I know that it's going to make me feel this. If it's working for other people, it's going to make them want to drop to the floor, you know, and that was, anecdotally, I had that a few people were feeling like that the other night at Pioneer Works in New York. Someone said that they were lying on the floor and they looked up and it was just a sea of bodies stuck to the ground. This idea of something that was, and this is another thing that's more as part of it, it's not supposed to be a transcendental experience, it's supposed to be something that drags you down into being. It's supposed to take you out of your body, but it's not a spiritual experience. It's not like that there's some kind of sky god that's sucking you up. It's something that's sucking you. It's a much more elemental thing, you know, much more like imminent experience rather than transcendental, you know, something sucking you into what it is to be, you know, not just human, but part of this existence.
I feel like that's something that sort of marks the whole era you were with Coil quite strongly, like these albums like Music to Play in the Dark or particularly Astral Disaster, which is one of my favorites. And I think this one was like recorded, this was only a few months after Time Machine, I think. And this was recorded, I think, subterranean in London somewhere, and that album speaks a lot more to the band's history with folkloric elements and this sort of stuff. But maybe you could tell me a bit about outside of Time Machines, how this sort of came into play.
Well, yeah, I mean, you know, the elements, you know, the mythic elements that were part of Coil and are always part of my life, or, you know, and it's not something that it's not like necessarily a daily practice, but in terms of like mythic elemental spirits, it's like Pan is absolutely, you know, a huge part of everything that I do. You know, those elements of the darker, what could at first glance seem like fear, but is actually just another part of just the beauty of existence. And always the subterranean aspect is always never not been part of what I do, and it was always a part of, not along with other parts with Coil, but the idea of being either subterranean, it's either subterranean or submerged, with Astral Disaster, and it was both, because the studio was in Southwark in London, and it's right at where the river, it was underneath the level of the River Thames, and the one wall of the studio on the other side was basically the river. And the Thames was a really important part of Coil, this idea of this strange vein of water that, that cuts through the center of London, with all of London's strange energies that, go back, thousands of years. And also, there's one track on one Coil track that we called Lost Rivers of London, which is a book. I forget the name of the author, but he explored all these rivers that still exist, but they're basically buried. They were covered over, and there's buildings over them, there's roads, but they still exist. They're under the surface of London, carrying water to the River Thames, and that was just a really powerful thing to think about. Like buried rivers, because we always got with this idea that London was a living entity. It wasn't just a city that was actually alive. And back then, I've kind of lost connection with London now, with that feeling, because every time I go back, it feels just like about money and nothing else. But I'm sure if I spent enough time, I'd reconnect with that dark. I feel like a tourist when I go.
Well, does it feel similar in New York at all?
New York, yeah. But New York, it's always assumed that, and it's a different assumption. It's like New York's always about commerce and money, but then you find the space, then you create the spaces that are not, and somehow it works. It shouldn't work, but it does. So with New York, there was never any misunderstanding about that. London, even though it was always a port and always a commercial city, had other things feeding into it that I think are probably gone, they're lost, which is hugely sad.
This is awful. They're destroying it terribly, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so just to move on to some of your more recent work, so there was quite a big gap, sort of, you disappeared a bit after, I believe after the death of John Balance, and you sort of stopped making music for a while. Like how did that affect you, and what eventually made you come back to making music?
Well, just the Jeff's death affected me really deeply, to the point where it kind of like paralyzed me a little bit. I'd been going through some, personal issues, just with a lot of the explorations that we did in Coil, kind of as it happened with Balance and Sleazy. We followed those paths to their most destructive ends, and with me, I needed a couple of years just to get out of that mindset, and I was kind of coming out of it and feeling like I needed to stop making any music. For about 2 years, I couldn't even think about making music, and I was about ready to start, and then Balance died, and it affected me. It was something that I expected to happen. Anyone who was close to Balance knew that we were going to get that phone call one day. But it was, Rose, my ex-wife, called me to tell me, and she was like, did one of those things that people say that you don't expect, sit down, I have something to tell you. And I was like, sit down, what? And she told me, and it was like, I couldn't understand. She said these words and it didn't make sense. It was like someone speaking in a foreign language, and just I had this crazy whine in my ear, this like strange noise. And for some reason people die and it affects you, but he was such an important part of my life that it kind of gutted me in a way that I couldn't make any music for a while. So I started working on things, and it felt like starting from when I was 16 again. It felt like starting absolutely from scratch, and that I had to, in a good way, I didn't feel like I could start where I left off. I bought some modular equipment and started just playing around with it and didn't release anything. The first things I did were collaborations with people, and before I felt that I really wanted to do anything on my own. And it just felt good. I didn't feel that there was any rush or anything to do anything. I didn't feel particularly attached to any. There wasn't an urgency. I was happy just to collaborate, with the compound I thing that I did that Peter put, that Mago put out, and.
Well, there's feels like there's a lot of continuation of similar themes from Time Machines actually. I suppose with Collapse, it sort of restarts again where. But instead of this time freezing feeling, it's this waking sleep or whatever you want to call it, just lack of sleep. I feel a bit like it at the festival you were saying, and how did that sort of idea return to you? And it still speaks to you very strongly. I mean, I don't know, maybe you're using less ayahuasca these days, but you can still get a similar state of mind, I suppose.
I think that's the one thing. It's because this. That what you were saying about waking sleep, that feeling, that hypnagogic feeling of, when your thoughts unravel, when you're where you're in that feeling where you're not really sure what's going on. I think that was, even when I had that hiatus of not doing anything, it never went away. I think that's kind of inscribed in my DNA, that way of, I think it's informed everything that I've done, and I kind of realized that after the fact. It clearly informed the compound I work. It's just there. It will never leave. Whatever we did back then, rewrote the way that, just rewrote the way that I think. And maybe it was always there, just like I said, growing up in Scotland and hearing bagpipe music, maybe that was it. Maybe that was the viral vector. But
so what do you think are the sort of key benefits of this experience of putting yourself in this place? I mean, what are the broader implications over your life of thinking like this?
I don't know if benefits is I'm joking. No, I'm joking. So it allows me to. I find that I can access that space easily. It doesn't take a lot of work to know where to go, and it's also useful, I think, in a kind of meditative sense as well. Outside of music, because I naturally have a lot of energy. I kind of so I find it hard to sleep, and sometimes I'll only get like a couple of hours sleep a night. So what I do then with that feeling of this took me a long time to realize that rather than fighting that, just not being able to sleep and just feeling like out of it all the time from lack of sleep is like, well, if that's your life, then just use it. Take that strange feeling that you get from lack of sleep, where everything seems really psychotropic and hallucinogenic. If that's what don't let that be don't let that be a curse, let that be something that you feed off of. And I kind of like did that with both Collapse and Unnatural Channel. And even the one track that has intelligible vocals on it, it's with Roxy Farman from Wetware. I asked her to do, and I said, don't sing words, just make, do what you do, just make some noises. And she completely ignored it and tapped into something that I talked about. So the idea of being sleep deprived, which I think is perfect, and I'm so happy that she ignored me.
Yeah, no, that's perfect, that bit on that track. What is it she says, like,
this is what it's like.
This is what it's like, I can't. But, well, the theme of this festival this year is Turmoil, and this feels also like a theme that's kind of entering your music, actually, particularly on Unnatural Channel, I felt, because a lot of this drift started to disappear, and there's more like punishing sounds and more rhythms, and it's getting a bit more industrial, for want of a better term. And how was this a very active choice? Like, do you feel like we're in a state of emergency?
I mean, there's no question. And that, I think, as artists, we're always, maybe we're not always, but a lot of people are very much subliminally informed about what was going on. Collapse was also, but Unnatural Channel. The industrial part of it wasn't a deliberate idea to tap into my roots. It was like after the fact, I was like, oh, wow, this does sound kind of, that was accidental and subliminal, and I'm happy with it, that it's, that it's definitely a clear reference to the kind of, industrial past. But it was deeply, deeply affected by everything that was going on, the way that the world felt, with, first of all Brexit, and then everything that happened in the US. This strange hallucinogenic feeling that we're, going into something that, some insanely uncharted waters, but also being cognizant of the fact that these are only strange, uncharted waters for privileged white people, the world's been a shit show for everyone else, it's just for white people in the West, it's like, oh my God, this is crazy. This has never happened before. The world is a disaster. And it's like, well, it is for us now, but, look at the way that people, and because of our actions, what's happened in other parts of the world, So it's partly kind of reaping what we've sowed, it's come round full circle to give us back what we've given, But having said that, that's not a reason just to go, give up. It's not like, but it is. This is neoliberalism. This is what it is about. This is how we are, and will we burn the planet out with us, or will we make change? Will we do something about it?
Well, this is one of the big benefits of particularly listening to you the other day, playing Time Machines. Like you say, it brings you down a bit and sends you inward, and you think a bit more about, I think a bit more about reality. Like you say, it's not actually pulling you away. Well, to not be so negative.
It's not escape. It's not supposed to be escapism. But look, I'm not going to, however anyone wants to use the work, is like once someone's created something, it's out of your hands. I have no control of it. I did it. I put it out there. It is its own entity, and how it interacts with other entities, it's none of my business. But so then there's the intention, and then there's the
Well, so not to end on such a negative note. Like, I also feel that.
I actually think right now with what's happening, it's like one of those when William Burroughs, like. The title Naked Lunch, his idea was that the moment where everyone sees exactly what's on the end of your fork, this is it. We're in a naked lunch moment. We know for the first time for a lot of us, we know the nature of what's going on. We can't hide from it. It's like there's a reason why this exists, and I think that alone, acknowledgement and understanding of what's going on is a key first step.
Can't ignore it anymore, basically. Yeah. But I've heard you in the past speak quite positively about the scene in New York these days, and you've come from, in the sort of time you were out of music, a lot changed in what it's like to be an artist, particularly an underground artist, and I feel like it's a very good time to be a musician, I suppose, in a lot of ways nowadays.
Yeah, I mean, it's strange, because I've been around forever, people talk to me and they have this assumption that, don't you miss this era? What don't you miss? And I was like, hell no, I'm so lucky and so fortunate to be making music and to be part of and to witness other people making music right now. That what's happening in New York and in Berlin and just like almost everywhere that I go, I'm seeing these little communities of people doing just incredible work. It's New York is really inspiring. For all its savage kind of like inequalities and gentrification that's going on in New York, people have somehow managed to carve out their spaces, in spite of all the odds that they carved out these spaces to be able to create work that is just simply, mind-blowing. The work that people are doing. Some people are doing some incredible stuff there. My friend Ciara Black has just moved from New York to here to bring what she created in New York to Berlin with her own work and with No Tech. That's one of the elements that I was talking about. There's people creating these communities around them, not waiting for something to be created or handed to them. Especially in New York where there is no funding. Funding's great. I wish we had it in New York. I wish we had it everywhere. People don't realize how important it is. But in New York, there's nothing, so people have to scrape it together with whatever, whatever they can.
Well, on that note about community, I suppose, does anyone have any questions for Drew? Nothing? No one? All right, well, I guess we'll leave it there then.
Thank you very much.